Today, the topic, as Everett mentioned, I have, the topic of whether public health has become too political. And I should give the quick answer, but in case anybody jumps off. The answer is no, in my view. And, I hope to persuade you during this conversation. But let me begin by saying that, I'm a social epidemiologist who trained, I have a doctorate in social epidemiology. And if I had spoken to you probably 3 years ago, many of you would not know what an epidemiologist is. But COVID, unfortunately, forced many of us in public health really into the limelight, into media interviews, into meeting with politicians, with ministers of finance, really forced public health to become political. But what is happening right now, as the world is returning to normal, is a conversation and a debate with whether public health should remain political, whether this is an opportunity to go back to the roots. The discipline of public health began to separate from medicine because medical doctors were focused on individual health and well-being and treatment, and public health was interested in social well-being and community well-being, and really issues of public housing and water quality. Those were issues of public health. But over the years, public health has become really a technical field where epidemiologists more and more are focusing on quantitative methods, being able to talk about causal inference, and in my view, became quite narrow and apolitical because it was about this technical expertise. So the conversation today, I hope to sort of persuade you that it's time for public health to return to its roots and really be much more political and much more at the forefronts. So let me start with a story. This last month in November, my team put out a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's considered one of the top medical, journals. That would be a check mark on technical, expertise on masks. We looked at masking policy in Boston. There was sort of a natural experiment that happened in the sense that the entire state, the governor removed masks, meaning, you do not have to have a statewide mask policy, but allowed different towns and cities, their school committees to decide when to remove their mask policies in schools. That allowed us to have a natural experiment because it didn't happen overnight all in one place. And there was a sequential sort of lifting of masks. And there were two communities, Boston and Chelsea, two communities that had been the hardest hit by COVID early on, that kept the masks in place. So we were able, working with, again, the experts on causal inference, to use a very technical difference in difference, academic sort of modeling, really, to show that actually masks work in schools. It's one of the probably most, I would say, one of the best studies. In the absence of the ability to do an RCT to force some kids to wear masks and some not, you can't really do experimental design. So it's a natural experiment, and it was very strong. Yet, and here's the yet in the politicization, the team working on this piece, we're all social epidemiologists. We've all been trained to think about systems and policy, how racism, how how inequities in terms of economic advantage are shaping the conditions, not only of the schools, disinvestment in schools. Some schools had better, ventilation, some didn't, but also the impacts of this policy. So we wrote in the discussion quite a bit about structural racism. We talked about racial capitalism. We used words that are really not commonly found in the New England Journal of Medicine. And we were criticized for that by some. So the New York Post, and I'll quote, said, "Masks reduce racism. Study is latest sign U.S. medical establishment is insanely, perilously woke." And, not just the tabloids. There were some actually pretty established doctors who asked, public health has already become so politicized during the pandemic. Why would you want to further contribute to that, undermining your own credibility as a scientific actor? And actually, the Boston Globe reached out to me with that question. And in yesterday's online newspaper, there's a debate between me and that doctor about whether public health should be political. I'll share it at the end of this discussion, but I want to bring it to the forefront because there's this assumption that there is political and not political. And yet within public health, the risks of staying apolitical are rarely articulated. We rarely say that apolitical basically means the status quo. Those who have power and privilege continue to benefit, and those who don't basically are left, apolitical means status quo. And we don't typically think about that. So with COVID, it's been a wake-up call in the United States, but across the globe, in the sense of people have suddenly said, oh my gosh, a new disease, something that nobody had immunity to. So you can't say that there was a genetic predisposition or some people did, has had a differential impact on different groups of people. So some people early on turned to genes and to biology, but soon we learned that it wasn't that. It was that, some of us had the privilege to work from home. Others were essential workers and had to be, continuously exposed. Some individuals are able to, some of the guidance, wash your hands and isolate in your own private room. Well, that assumes that there is running water and that you're not living in a multi-family, multi-generational, one-bedroom home. There were all of these assumptions about the structures. So I teach a class right now at Harvard on political epidemiology. It's actually called, and again, you can see my political views, it's called Political Epidemiology, Oppression and Resistance as Determinants of Health. So for those of you who have been in the UN and, in global development, you've probably heard of the term the social determinants of health. The commission that the WHO put forward in 2005, 2008 was really important. And what it's been sort of narrowly interpreted to mean, and we use this term all the time as a communication shorthand, that health isn't shaped simply by your access to healthcare, but also by the places where you live, where you love, where you pray, where you go to school, about the environment. We often stop there. We just make that statement, health is shaped by the social conditions. So if you are poor, if you are living in an environmentally polluted environment, if your school doesn't have ventilation, bad luck. Now, what I think many of us are asking is to say, let's interrogate the why. Why are some people living in schools that are not ventilated? Why is climate change impacting some communities more? And I should say, I went back to the original document and the commissioners had it there. So the overall recommendations that they had, there were three. One was to improve daily living conditions. And I think that's what has become kind of the language. Number two was to tackle the inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources. They named power and resources and inequitable, but somehow that is what politics is. It's naming and talking about accountability, about power, about resources, and who has access to them. So they were becoming political, but it was sort of, left as it's been forgotten. And the number three was to measure and understand the problem and assess the impact of action. And that measure and understand the problem is really speaking to the folks like me who find ourselves right now on the academic side, on the research side. So how do we do good research to measure and understand the problem if we're asked to remain apolitical? So in this debate that I had around this paper with a scholar, he ended up kind of coming more towards me and he said, well, the problem isn't that it's political, but that it's partisan. And I think that there is something to be said there, that in the United States, for example, right now, some issues have become partisan. And it's not that the issue itself is the issue. So, LGBT rights or reproductive rights or climate change or, racism and what we do about, has become, associated with a certain party. But I would say that in itself is a moment in time. That doesn't mean that we have to step away from talking about racism or talking about climate change or talking about reproductive rights, but have to figure out a way in doing that without undermining the credibility of the science. So this is kind of the conundrum where, I'm in when many of us who are vocal about our political views are in. And I hope that this conversation, we can actually have a lot of exchange on, what are the best steps? What are the risks of going too far, but also what are the risks of staying silent? And I think that risk, for many of us who are in a privileged group, I identify as a white cisgender, I'm a mom, I experience, discrimination because of my gender, because of my age, but I can't claim to really understand what it means to be, in a group or in an identity that's discriminated against. So the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, where I work, really focuses on discrimination. And this political epidemiology course, and I want to broaden it beyond the US. We have a Roma rights program led by a Roma scholar, and she talks about how discrimination shapes health outcomes for the Roma. I'm Greek, and I grew up being told that, and I put it in quotations because so many of us have allowed ourselves to use this, racist term, gypsy. But, my grandmother would say the gypsies will take you if you don't eat your meal. And this was commonplace in Europe. And still European politicians allow themselves to have this trope that the health of the Roma is worse because they don't want to assimilate, because they want to live in poor living conditions. And so, Roma health and discrimination is one chapter. At the FXB Center, we have a new program on Palestinian rights and how, discrimination and exclusion in the Palestinian context, it's been exceptionalized. It's become like this is a unique setting. But in fact, if you think about racism and discrimination around the world, there are a lot of learnings in settler colonialism, which is, this idea that, where we're seeing indigenous health rights across the world, whether in the US or Latin America, that there was, there's a theoretical and intentional suppression, that the health of indigenous people is not because by chance, it's because of these legacies, these histories, and that, it is political to talk about our history, and yet public health and medical scholars are often completely oblivious. They show up and they've never heard about the history. And so, what does it mean for education, for training? So these are some of the sort of issues that I'm debating as, I lead the center as the acting director. Right now, I'm also the executive director. Our faculty director will be returning. She's currently serving as the New York State Health Commissioner, Mary Bassett, and she'll be returning to Harvard. But one of the debates we have in an academic setting is like, how far can we go? What does it mean to do research which is credible, which will be published in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, and where we will still be seen as credible scientists, but who can actually have an impact? And I think that is a really important issue. And if we don't get it right, we can, continue publishing papers that never reach policymakers, that never reach UN actors, and therefore, you get a check mark in your CV, you publish in the Lancet, but you have no impact, or you try to engage, and then you're accused of being too political. So this is sort of where the conversation I hope will go today. And I should say that, I did work at the UN for a while, and because many of you are there, I think it's a conversation that the UN should be having, and I believe it is having. So, the ICSC rules. I was a UN international civil servant, and I was told, and I'm going to read it because it's a quote, impartiality implies tolerance and restraint, particularly in dealing with political or religious convictions. While the personal views remain inviolate, international civil servants do not have the freedom of private persons to take sides or to express their convictions publicly on controversial matters, either individually or as members of a group, irrespective of the medium used. This can mean in certain situations, personal views should be expressed only with tact and discretion. And I remember, being told that I couldn't post on social media about the Me Too movement or about Black Lives Matter, about issues that clearly the UN believes are values of the UN, but we were restricted. We were told you can't march for climate change because marching is a political sign, and that's, violating your obligations as an international civil servant. I have heard that this is being debated right now because of this idea that, can we do our work without being open about that these issues are not political in the partisan sense, but they're political because political structures shape them, and therefore political structures and policies can solve them. And so it's an interesting tension. And I should say that I was an international civil servant from 2007 till 2020. When I resigned, I was at, I took a few leaves of absence to work at the health department in New York City, but all of those leaves of absences were, special leave without pay. So I maintained my status. But after I came to Harvard, again, on special leave without pay, in 2020, I ran for US Congress. And that decision to run, clearly I had to resign from the UN because that was political, we're not allowed to run for office while being, and that I understand. So I, in the conversation, I'd be happy to also speak about my congressional run. It was 4 months. It was much shorter than what is typically done. But, I was making the case that I began my campaign in April 2020. The elections were September 2020, that COVID was going to be a 2 to 5 year sort of issue, and that Congress had zero scientists, zero or very few scientists, zero epidemiologists, zero public health folks, and that would be a real challenge when thinking about what policies to put in place, how much money, where resources, and fundamentally the equity issues. I thought that the United States had so many structural issues that, it was actually March 1st, 2020, when there was one US death. And I wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying that we would expect that we would see the worst, among wealthy countries, the worst epidemic in this country because of these structural issues and about racism. And unfortunately played out. It's really horrible to say, I told you so, but really it was trying to raise the alarm. So, I want this to be conversational, so I'm going to stop there. But I think the challenge is, people push back and say, scientists, you're losing your credibility. But if you don't have scientists speaking on these issues, on climate change and LGBT rights, then how can you as a policymaker or an advisor really take that science? And, my hypothesis is that apolitical or neutral science really is just not being clear and open about what assumptions are being made, and oftentimes reinforcing the status quo, so that the inequities that we're seeing in health outcomes are seen as unfortunate, but not unjustifiable and changeable. And so I'll end there. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Wow, wonderful, Natalie. The floor is open. Comments or questions? And Natalie, what we do is take a number of comments or questions, and then I'll come back to you. Yes, Jim.
So you remind me of so many things, and you brought some clarity to some things that I worked in. I spent most of my life working with President Carter from the Carter Center, and I was a big part of the engineering of that center to be bipartisan or nonpartisan. And you reminded me how lucky I was that things like guinea worm and river blindness, which are foundational changes in global public health, weren't political. And so I think about, Lord Cook, who was Reagan's chairman, campaign chairman, who chaired the library, Reagan Library, turned out to be one of our strongest supporters in some of these global health issues. Democrats and Republicans, people on all sides of parties in different countries, we could go to them and talk to them about an issue in the world. And many of these things were a part of that discussion. We want to go to people who have very little infrastructure, who don't have access to things. We want to share with them how they can do something about their own health for the future. But I don't remember political issues ever being overt. I don't ever remember being shut down because we were taking a side that might benefit one US party or the other. And that was actually true across the globe where we worked. So I just wonder if there are any lessons in that, if one could go back through and do some analysis of how all that came down. Carter had, we all like to say that Carter had some moral high ground. So no despot was too bad for him to go and talk to about instituting guinea worm or river blindness work in those countries. And, and he felt like he had to wash his hands after a lot of those people that he talked to around the world, but we did not avoid that. And I don't remember any situations where we got condemned by the press or by one party or the other or anybody for talking to XYZ leader, because we made the case that the people were what was important. And if we could get them this message of global health message, it might benefit some nasty leader for that to go well in his country, his or her country, all his. But we weren't precluded from doing that because we were dealing with the despot. And that's not, that was not 100% of the universe, but in the 27 countries where we had guinea worm, there were several pretty nasty folks. But we never worried about that. So I just wonder if that case study, which is now 30 years old, has any relevance to your teaching of your course and so forth, because it really is amazing what leadership, was able to do. Taking your point, Everett, of, getting somebody to take this on and lead it was what was needed. But I look at the donors, the big donors that put into that, and I'd say that, it was an issue that we somehow depoliticized. I don't remember depoliticizing it. I just remember that body of parties was extraordinarily mixed on a political scale. Maybe it's the times that have changed.
Thank you very much, Jim, for this critical point. Another one. Yes, Saudamini.
Thank you. That was very brilliant and I think rightly provocative. It just so happens that last Friday, I attended the public lecture of the Arthur Ashe Institute in Brooklyn on their 30th year anniversary. Krishna and I did work there last year on the mental health impacts on children in vulnerable communities due to COVID. And I follow up with them. They're incredible. And the person that they had lecture, it was Dr. George Benjamin, he's executive director of APHA, and they presented to the APHA, by the way, Krishna, just last month, this year, again, on that work, and it was well received, they said, so that was great. But he spoke specifically in such alignment with what you're saying, and he spoke specifically about how structural racism, is beyond social determinant, but as its impact on health. So I think there's such a synergy in what you've said and what that was about. I want to somehow connect you. I mean, I think it would be an incredible alliance. So I just want to throw that out. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, Alejandro.
Thank you, Natalie. I really enjoy your presentation. I just want to share with you a couple of close and major experience in my life about several of the things that you share with us. The first one is this dialectic thing that you have trying to promote humanitarian and disaster response or working with the community from a public health approach. I think that that's a very interesting point to think about. I have been working as a scholar in the master on health in the medical school of a university in Latin America, and we usually work specifically on that, how to deal disaster and public health, And it's exactly what you say, okay? In this case, we are talking about the social construction of the conditions that make people vulnerable, and not how to respond, how to count how many morbidity and mortality you will have, So that's a very interesting thing to work on, I have been invited based on this experience in some universities in the United States, and I always found that the approach of the medical school were how to respond, how to attend the massive number of fatalities and injuries. But I also always say that that's not that's not the approach. That is that's not the approach that you must try to remove from a public health approach. That's more that's a different thing. And the second one that I want to share with you is that this concern that you have about how can be possible to promote that scientific products could go beyond the paper and the publication and try to go to a place in which you can do something more in public policy. I think that I had a very tough experience in the year 2000 when I was working as a scholar at the university, and suddenly the government called us and told me, you are the scientist, you must help us to solve the problem of the disaster. Here you have $4 million. Do something, organize a national plan of applied research and technology to solve the situation that we are living. In that moment, the challenge became bigger because you move to the other side, you go to the dark side. And you start to see, okay, now I am not a scientist. I have a lot of money. I need to decide what to do or where to put the money in order to promote that the product of all these scientific things could be as usable as possible. No? I published that experience in a couple of books. I presented in Japan. I remember as an invited scholar doing something in Kyoto and also in India. So I would love to share that documentation with you, just to show you how was our experience dealing with that challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. More comments? Fred, did I see your hand? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Martin.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, really interesting. And I'd be interested to know how you think it's best to respond when governments of a very right-wing persuasion, such as my own, have an immediate knee-jerk reaction against any critique which highlights the levels of poverty in the United Kingdom. And it's extraordinary. For example, UNICEF did a recent report on levels of poverty in Britain, and it got told that it was completely inappropriate for UNICEF to be talking about what's happening in Britain. It should be concentrating on countries where people are really poor. And recently there was a small survey which identified that in the last month, 1/3 of British households missed a meal because they were too poor to buy the food that they needed. Now, I'm not sure whether that's scientifically accurate, but it gives you an idea of the level of poverty in this country. My closest personal friend is a public health expert and was director of public health for one of the English regions. And when the COVID experience came upon us, he worked with other public health directors to try and promote a public health response to the COVID emergency in this country. And they were totally unsuccessful because the highly centralized Ministry of Health worked out ways of issuing procurement tenders for all kinds of equipment and so on, completely bypassing the public health model. So we went rather for total lockdowns and so on. And I mean, there were some very articulate public health professors who you could hear on the national media, but their message simply wasn't getting through to the political leadership. And we ended up with the kinds of levels of deaths that you've had in the United States.
Thank you very much, Martin. Mark, and then Fred.
Yeah, no, I think it was very helpful, and we need to take a look back at recent history because, for the COVID epidemic, I was so disappointed that all the lessons learned from the AIDS epidemic weren't applied. In the AIDS epidemic, we had ACT UP, we had Silence Equals Death. I was actively involved in that, and it was highly political. And when Peter Piot was the head of UNAIDS, it was highly political. Broke out of all the UN norms to challenge status quo politicians. Didn't happen in COVID at all. Greg Gonzalez from ACT UP was like the only voice from the AIDS generation trying to create a discussion. So we've had experience, but we gotta up our game.
Thank you very much, Fred.
Yeah, great. Just to point out, I think I saw Carolyn's hand go up at the beginning and she's been overlooked. So you might want to call on her later.
She'll be next. She'll be next.
Thanks. Natalia, you're preaching to the convinced on this end. I really enjoyed your talk. It was brilliant, but I think you framed your fundamental question backwards. the question shouldn't be, how do you do good research while remaining apolitical, but rather, how can you continue doing good research while getting it published, maintaining your political stance? I mean, it's so clear to me, the world is at a junction where you can't be quiet. There's on so many fronts, we're facing disaster. And if we try and censor ourselves, we're giving in to the powers that be. All the words that the right uses to disqualify wokeness, politically correct, reverse discrimination, neutral, impartiality, objectivity, etc., critical race theory, it's a bunch of hokey, frankly. And if you accept that on face value and say, oh, they're setting the terms because they run the New York Times or they have the money to finance my research, you're losing the battle already. So more power to you. Please keep on being political, but don't allow the powers that be to set the terms of the debate. Over.
Thank you very much, Fred. Carolyn.
Power to the people, Fred. I love it. Natalie, I don't know really how to frame this question, but I see that you are doing a lot of bridging, and you also seem, not only in your bio do you actually speak many languages, I think you speak different languages of different types of sectors that need to work together to make meaningful change here. And there aren't many people that are in that kind of liaison position. That's something I've really been focused on lately, is we need these points of connectivity between all of our systems. And I think it's a major barrier to systems change efforts that are really like steaming forward. But I don't know that without those connective points and that connective tissue that you seem to really represent in your experience and the way you speak about issues, even on a super microcosmic level of going to the doctor, you feel like your doctor is not a human and can't speak to you as a human being. So I think that science and social bridge is going to need to get much stronger. And I'd just like to know from your experience, how can we get other people in those positions, or how can we adjust our language or go harder on our language to build those bridges? Thanks.
One more comment, anyone?
Just briefly.
Yeah,
Okay.
Niels and then Krishna.
Did you say?
Niels, go ahead.
Okay, thanks so much, Natalia. Well, when I was regional director for UNICEF for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Mark is very well aware, we worked a lot on the social determinants of health. And, you know, we tried to use data as much as possible. To take one example, we tried to prepare the first major report on Afro-descendants and the levels of exclusion. The fact that they went 5 to 9 years less to school than whiter children in Latin America. This distinction even of indigenous communities of the same ethnicity in Chile and in Bolivia. In Chile, the malnutrition, chronic malnutrition was much lower among indigenous community than in Bolivia, but it was 4 times higher than the other population of Chile. And in Bolivia, it was also 4 times higher than among other population. So disaggregation of data is extremely important. The other aspect, I think, was geographical disaggregation. We looked at Quito. 70% of the high schools in Quito were in the northern part of Quito, where 30% of the population lived, and they were the more affluent. You didn't need to say they were the more affluent, but that was the fact. And only 30% of the secondary schools were in the southern part, where 1.7 million people lived, and so on. So disaggregating data, I think, is one area. I think we also need to recognize that sometimes the human rights abuses of what are considered the left are not sufficiently researched and highlighted. From the days when I was repatriating in 1980, school children that had been abducted by Sanla and Cipra to Mozambique and to Zambia. All those children were entire schools that had been abducted and taken across the borders. The parents were not allowed to reunite with them, and they were presented to the international community as orphans. Just from Zambia, 11,500 of them, there were only 36 who were really orphans. The massive recruitment of children by SPLA in South Sudan. I think for too long, with the liberation movements, we have not raised sufficiently what's the floor of human rights. And when they get to power, they abuse in every possible way, and they get into corruption. And we are seeing that on a massive scale in Latin America at the moment. I might sound like a right-wing conservative when saying this, but I think research needs to research different angles of the social determinants of health from a human rights perspective. And I think in the dialogue with faith people, we have disregarded a little bit that too much and left the field too open for the conservative right to manipulate them by just using a couple of issues, the LGBTIQ issues or the issues of gender. And much more could be said about it. But I'm not helping to give you answers. I'm simply doing the conversation just like you did, Natalia. Thanks.
Thank you, Niels. Krishna.
Thank you, Natalia. I would like to recall that in nutrition, we had similar challenges that started, several decades ago, because the world of nutritionists dominated the whole conversation, and they were trying to find, quick fixes, whereas the whole narrative and the analysis had to be broadened. And what we learned from there were a couple of things. One was proper conceptualization. Any research, any analysis should not be based on preconceived notions, but contextualized, and obviously based on a proper conceptualization, including looking at really the root causes. I mean, always to focus on the root causes, which I'm sure you are already converted, but again, I want to repeat that would be a lesson for the students and others to that. Let's look at the proper concept. And within that, if we can integrate human rights approaches where possible, including, inequalities of different kinds and so on, that makes it even rich, but not in every society human rights approaches are accepted. So that is a challenge. And then broadening the analysis. This is all more research academic world. Those two are done. But when the findings are come, they have implication at the societal level, at the political level, at resource control and so on. I think where the professional world fails more is where to take those findings and ideas to the right constituencies. If you tell the medical world that a 5% increase in food price is going to cause 9% increase in wasting of under children, they are helpless. There is nothing that the medical world can perhaps do. But where does and by whom that idea has to go to make that change, that price increases would not be, or this would be protected. The poorer people, the most likely people affected by it to be protected. Is where do you go? That's where I think the whole professional world, including some of the agencies that are working, fail. And that's where the whole world of advocacy comes in. So I think the questions you are posing are not only about research and analysis, but where do we go with the information as well? We are with you. All the best.
Thank you. Yeah, Jim, very brief, please.
So you guys are really provoking me. But I think of one of the things that came to my mind was picking your fights and leadership, and then being proactive. So what I wonder if in your research and your work, if you could help, if we could help you identify some people who are not going to have their voices quietened because because of the system, if you would, the political parties. There are people that are above being hushed about certain things. Now, that's not universal. So the idea is, what fights could we pick? What are some things that we could pick that would be that wouldn't be such lightning rods, but that would let some leaders be proactive on some issues. They may not be the most important issues, but they'd be a group of issues, and then get some wins on that. So when I think about the US party affiliation and political makeup of some of the people that did the most in the MDGs, you had people who had been rabid Republicans leading work to support the United Nations. Only a few years after the Republican president had said, "I'm not going to pay our dues." And that guy's name was Ray Chambers. But how did you get this staunch Republican, whose business partner was another conservative former US Treasury Secretary? How do you get that person to be the champion of the poorest people in the world and do the most about things like malaria and TB and tuberculosis and AIDS, along with child and maternal health and things like that? If you look at that portfolio of the MDGs and the progress that was made on under 5 deaths, and to know that that had extraordinary leadership from very conservative Republican leaders in a time when that was very unpopular, it's because that person's own power and that person's own ability to convince people of his own stripe, as well as people across the aisle, what worked. So I just think that proactive leadership on something that's not so charged, but that feel very, very important, that leadership and that being proactive, I think that might be a formula of things that you could work on and think about, because there's some great case studies in that that could be an answer to how we get some of these things done that are now being just completely wet blanketed. If you say some words on the internet, you are ruled out by that sector, the sector that opposes you. And it's not because they really don't believe that. It's just that it's politically incorrect for them to do anything about it. But is there a way to rise above that within those quarters? That would be my question.
Jim, thank you very much for that important point. Natalie, would you, you'll have to be a little bit brief because of the time, but please give your response to this.
This has been fantastic, Everett. And, obviously in 4 minutes, I can't answer every question, but I am going to start with Jim's and Fred's. Fred's call to me was continue, and Jim sort of said, should we pick issues? I should say we've crossed that line, Jim. I can't pick issues. I just did a big event on reparations, and so I've already gone into I'm picking all the lightning rod issues, Palestine reparations. So it's too late. And I think, as Fred said, maybe it's okay, and maybe it's to embrace it. And so what we're trying to say is we're building a team of scholar activists who are publishing in the New England Journal, but also unequivocally able to talk about these issues. But where I do think you have a point is, how do we do it? And Carolyn, thank you for noticing this bridge beat, because that's where I found that I've been successful. So I'm a local elected official in Brookline, and I'm clearly progressive in my views, but I get messages from even Republicans in the legislature who say, you make sense, you listen to us, you talk, you're there is something. And I think again, Jim, you talked about the history. I think we are in a place where it's very polarized. Social media allows a statement to be taken out of context, this idea that, we said that masks will cure racism. Clearly that was taken out of context. That's not what we said, but there's a post now. And so everybody who reads the New York Post can think that, we're really extreme. And so, I do think we're in a different political moment, and it is challenging. And I do think the United States politics are polarized, but also, Brazil, also, when we're, all across the globe, in Greece, there's currently a more right-wing government that is being, accused of espionage, and, and then the left wing, as Neil said, we can't say that left-wing governments haven't committed human rights abuses in the name of, the people. And so I do think it's a really, really challenging moment to be doing this work. And I do think that there will be discomfort. And I want to go to Martin's point about the UK and the poverty point, because I think that's one thing we did as the FXB Center in the last 3 years. The FXB Center at Harvard was a global health center, looking at disasters and conflict and overseas. And in the last 3 years, we said it's completely inappropriate for a center on health and human rights to not be looking at the United States and, you know, wealthy countries, and how health and human rights in these countries are also an issue. So we're doing work on incarceration and health, on structural racism and, you know, over policing, on homelessness. And so I think there is this kind of history, even in the aid sector, of like, you know, wealthy countries are giving advice to not wealthy countries, where in fact some of these political issues are cross-cutting, and you have, you know, poverty being, you know, both the UK, but also the United States. So during COVID, there's a movement here in the US called the Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend Barber. And he came to us and he said, every movement needs a footnote. Can you be our footnote? So he basically said, I just need to be able to come to you and say, what is the data source? Because I will go on public media and say, you know, people are dying at 5 times right. And it was actually a really amazing collaboration. And so I think oftentimes in the US, we think about the policymakers being governments, and in academia, we think about research. And somebody, I don't remember who mentioned it, oh, maybe it was Krish, about, or, you know, where are the, you know, how do you actually bring about change? And, you know, movements where I see some hope is, you know, the climate movement and the youth movement and the LGBTQ movement. In the past, maybe they were more siloed. And Mark, obviously, you know, the AIDS movement was so successful, and Greg is, you know, a friend, a colleague. But where I see some hope is that there is a push to be cross-cutting, to talk about environmental racism. So the climate movement taking on some of the language of the, you know, Black Lives Matters movement. And similarly, the LGBTQ community may be joining forces with the public health folks and saying, you know, let's learn from AIDS, monkeypox is on the horizon. How do we, you know, think about rights? So I just want to end with a note of optimism that I have seen more people trying to cross, both across sectors, crossing between different roles, while also recognizing our institutions have MPOX. Yes, apologies. This is, yes. You know, our institutions have their own, you know, and you can, so the advice I gave to students is pick where you want to be. I haven't figured out where I want to be. The challenge to return to the UN is that I would have to give up the entire political, like I find myself able to be a professor, lead a center, and be an elected official. And the UN says you can't do that. And so that is a challenge. And I think for the future of development, you know, we should think about who are the people we're recruiting? How do we bring people with lived experience? You know, there's an entire other conversation around HR in order to do this work better. But I know I've gone over by a minute, and I don't know if I answered everybody's questions, but I was delighted. You know, it was really wonderful to speak to you and to the provocations. And for those of you who shared that you could connect me with people or share your case studies, very much welcome that future interaction. And thank you for inviting me, Everett.
Natalie, we end always with a very quick round the room, very brief final comment. Krishna, would you be first?
No, I mean, I really appreciate it. It has been quite stimulating, and wish you all the best on the great work we are doing. I know that we get confused at times when you want to walk outside the leak a little bit, but eventually you get there. It takes time and a bit of wisdom and thinking. So all the best to you. More power to you.
Thanks very much, Niels.
Thank you for all this, and let's continue establishing all the different components of the floor of rights. It's not something aspirational, it's the floor on which we need to stand, whichever of the political angles we come from.
Thank you, Niels. Carolyn.
More power to everybody. Onward. Thanks.
Jim, oh, Jim's on the phone. Alejandro.
Thank you very much for the chance. I enjoy a lot your talk, Natalia. I hope to keep in contact and know a little more about this huge challenge in which you are working. And thank you very much, Everett. It has been a great session. And I think that is the last one for the year. So Merry Christmas to everyone.
Thank you very much. Saudamini.
Thank you for today, and thank you for what you're doing. And I hope you don't give up the political, people don't speak openly about the lightning rod issues nearly enough, and you're willing and you're able to do that so powerfully. Please, I hope that continues. Thank you.
Jim.
Thank you so much. We really enjoyed that. You can tell that you irritated us.
Thanks, Martin.
No, thanks very much. Very useful. Just have an absolutely final thought leading perhaps to something eventually. Individual words are incredibly important. And if one can change the words, sometimes one can get a message across to people who might not realize what they're listening to.
Thank you. Thank you for that point. Mark.
For a very inspirational end of the year, and your HDPI correspondent in Honduras is signing off from Honduras, and I will see you in January from Panama.
That's great. That's great. Fred.
A real big thanks from this end, Natalia. You made us think in a lot of ways, and boy, I think the whole reason to stay out of the UN is precisely what you said. It's a valuable platform once you're in it, but I felt so free to write and think since I left, and I hope you can use that platform as strongly as possible. Over.
Thanks again, Natalie, for a wonderful session. Do you have one final comment?
Just thank you for the invitation, and so wonderful to meet so many of you.